Thank you so much for inviting me here this evening. I am Donna Nordmark Aviles. As she said, I am the author of 3 books. My grandfather, Oliver Nordmark, was an orphan train rider. He traveled from New York City. He was in an orphanage in 1906. He was 8 years old. His brother Edward was 5, and they traveled together in search of a home. They ended up in Bern, Kansas. Has anyone ever heard of the orphan train movement? Wonderful. So when I started giving this lecture many years ago, no hands ever went up. So the more I talk, it seems, the more people seem to know what's going on. The orphan train movement began in 1854, and it continued until 1929. During those 75 years, it's estimated that 250,000 children were transported from East Coast cities, mostly New York City and Boston, but certainly some other areas as well, to initially the Midwest, which was referred to at the time as the West. But by the time the movement ended in 1929, every state, with the exception of Alaska and Hawaii, had received at least one child from an orphan train. So it really did reach our whole country. You can turn the slide. So in 1854, we have to think, why did we need orphan trains? Well, there was a lot of immigration coming into our country from European countries, places like Ireland, Germany, Sweden, and they were coming across the Atlantic in hopes of a better life. Initially, they came into an area known as Castle Garden, which was located at the tip of Manhattan, and then eventually Ellis Island. There were no rules at the time as far as how many people could come or from what country, so they literally came by the millions. Just as an example, along the bottom of this slide, you'll see that in 1907, 1.2 million people came. That's 3,000 people a day. So imagine if here in Newcastle, tomorrow, 3,000 new people showed up, and they looked for places to live, they looked for schools to put their children in, they looked for places to work, and they all stayed. And the next day, another 3,000 came, and they did the same thing. And the next day, and the next, for an entire year. Can you imagine what Newcastle would look like? Or even Wilmington, for that matter. It was very crowded. This is a picture of an immigrant family during this time in a New York City apartment. This is a mom and her 8 children. Now, they live in one room of a 3-room apartment. In the other 2 rooms are 2 other families living the same way. They do everything in this one room. They eat, they cook, they sleep here. If the mom is taking in piecework for a factory, she's doing that right there in the room. In Oliver's case, he lived in the tenements with his mother and father and his brother and his sister. His father was a tailor by trade, so in the middle of his room was also a tailor table. So it was really crowded. Now remember, there are no social programs established yet during this time, so the factories are very dangerous places, and if a father gets hurt working and can't work, there's always another immigrant ready to take his place. And there's no money coming in for this family. There's no welfare, there's no food stamps, there's no unemployment. Certainly there's no OSHA requirements in the factories, so they're very dangerous places. So everybody is really on their own, and it's a very desperate time. They don't have the medicines that we have now for simple ailments, so disease was a problem as well. This is a slide of New York City in the early 1900s. This is the Lower East Side, which is where the tenements were. Incidentally, in New York City, there's a tenement museum. Has anyone ever been there? If you go to New York City and you're interested in this time period, check out the tenement museums. You'll be able to see exactly how people lived. And it's really very mind-boggling to think. This, in the Lower East Side, 522 people per acre. Just let that sink in for a minute. Does anyone live on an acre of land? I grew up on an acre of land. There were 6 of us. Sometimes it felt crowded. Imagine 522 people sharing that acre with you. If you were closer, you would see there's people on the balconies, there's people on the streets, they're on the sidewalks, they're around the corners. There's literally people everywhere. Now remember too, in the tenements, there's no air conditioning. In the summertime, 90, 100 degree New York summers, they would literally drag mattresses out onto the fire escapes just to get a breath of air. Some of the rooms that people lived in were interior rooms, so there weren't even any windows. This slide I added to my presentation because to me it just shows you how children will be children and they'll find a way to celebrate and enjoy Christmas even if there's absolutely no money. This is a Christmas tree. It's actually a broom in a bucket with a few trinkets hanging off of it. And one more family picture. This is an immigrant rag picker and his wife and 5 children. Again, living in one room and doing everything there. Now this picture is part of the Jacob Riis collection. I just want to take a minute to tell you who Jacob Riis was. He came to, immigrated, like everyone else, into the tenements from, I believe, Germany he was from. And he lived in the tenements. He bettered himself. He got a job with the police department. And when flash photography was developed, he became the photographer for the police department. And he would literally take a crew into the tenements, push open doors, and with his big flash, take pictures. And this is how they got to see what was going on in the tenements. The people who had wealth and money in New York City, everybody didn't live this way. Okay, people who were established and living in New York City, they didn't really realize what was going on in tenement life. They didn't really understand how people lived. His collection of pictures was published in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And this was very instrumental, along with Reverend Brace, who I'm going to tell you about in a minute, in bringing to light what was going on in the tenements and opening up the wallets of people who had money to try and solve the problem. Because of the overcrowding, it's estimated that 30,000 children were living on the streets of New York City during this time. What would happen is that the rooms or the spaces would become so crowded that the older children would have to go out and take care of themselves on the streets. And when I talk to school children, I'll often say, how old do you think you need to be to leave mom's house and go out and get a job and find a place to live and buy a car and put gas in it? And their little hands go up and 47 or 26. They really don't have any idea. Certainly nowadays the answer is probably anywhere between 18 and 35. I don't know. But in this time the answer was 8. So children as young as 8 were being forced to leave their homes and go out and take care of themselves. We talked about overcrowding. It could also be because one or both parents had died. It could also be that they were unable to support their children because of illness or loss of that job. And a lot of times, too, we have to remember the extended family is oftentimes back in the original country that the family came from, so they don't have that extra layer of help, safeguard, to help with the children. So for all those reasons, imagine 30,000 children living on the streets of New York City in the middle of the 1800s. This is a very famous picture of boys sleeping in an alley, also from Jacob's collection. If you study this time period all, you can't miss this picture. This is not staged, this existed. Okay, this is how the boys would sleep at night. And what they would do is, once they were out on the street, they would band together in small groups for friendship or protection. And they would do things like shine shoes or sell newspapers. Sometimes the little girls would pick wildflowers and sell them. They referred to them as flower girls. The children in general were often referred to as street Arabs. And at nighttime, they would look for a place that had a little protection, maybe under a stairwell or in an old box or something. But they did band together in little groups. Okay. Now, amazingly, the problem that I tried to just outline there rather briefly, of 30,000 children living on the streets alone, was solved by 2 people. And to me, it's really just a testament to what any one of us can do with our life if we really feel called to do something and we stick to it and see it through. The first person I want to tell you about is Reverend Charles Loring Brace. Now, this is a picture of him when he was much older. In 1853, he came to New York City on business. He was a wealthy Connecticut minister. He came from a wealthy family. And he was a minister. He came to New York City not had nothing to do with children or helping children. It was for his church. But he was struck right away by what he saw with so many homeless children living on the street trying to fend for themselves. And he felt called by God right then and there that this should be my life's work. This was my calling. This is what I need to do. I need to solve this problem. And he put his mind to it. And you know, he did solve the problem. And it did become his life's work. He died an old man, and he was still doing this type of reforming type of work. And his sons picked up after him and continued. The first thing that he did was he formed an organization called the Children's Aid Society. Anybody ever hear of that? He started off with missionary work, and then he founded the Children's Aid Society. It's still in operation today and still helping children. It was very instrumental during the Great Depression with a lot of families. It actually played into my father's life as well during the Depression. But he founded the Children's Aid Society. You can turn this slide. And once it was established, they built lodging houses throughout the city. And these were places where the children could come to get off the streets, get a hot meal, a place to sleep. And there was also education there as well, things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. That was what was sort of expected at the time, but as a reformer, he also realized that if he was really going to break this cycle of poverty and he was really going to solve this problem, these children needed to have a way to support themselves after they turned 18 and were on their own. So he also made sure that they had job training or skills, trades. They would learn various trades. He started industrial schools. He started nurseries. He actually started the first Fresh Air Fund. I know we've heard of the Fresh Air Fund that sends kids out of the city every summer. He wasn't part of that, but he had that idea long before they did, and he was doing that type of thing. He set up medical and dental clinics, and even the first schools for blacks after the Civil War. So he was trying to reach into every aspect of a child's life to try to solve the problem. Curiously, he looked at the adults who were living in poverty and thought, well, they're beyond help. I can't really do anything for them. I'm going to focus in on the children. This is a picture of a Children's Aid Society industrial school. And you can see it's jam-packed with children. They're clamoring for what he has to offer. This is a Children's Aid Society. It's called the James Center. And this was a feeding center where you could get a hot lunch of beef stew, whole wheat bread, potatoes, onions, 2 glasses of milk, applesauce for 5 cents. Every time I read that, I think, what child is saying, I'll take the onions? I don't know. Maybe they thought they were healthy. But for 5 cents. Now, you might wonder to yourself, 5 cents, he's going to charge them? They're living on the streets. Yes, he charged them because he was extremely opposed to almsgiving. Does everybody know what that is? He wants to teach you how to fish, not give you a fish. And so he wanted to teach these children that, you know, they're getting a few pennies here and there from the sale of newspapers, from shining shoes, from selling flowers. And he wants to teach them that the most important thing to do once you have your money is take care of yourself. You need a roof over your head and you need food in your stomach. And once the necessities are taken care of, if you want to take whatever's left and go over there and gamble with your friends in the corner, that's your own business. But he was trying to instill those kinds of values in the children. Now, certainly if a child showed up and didn't have the nickel, he would feed them anyway. This is a picture of boys in a cobbling class. Now, they had different types of classes for different trades that the kids could learn, and they could choose their own trade, and if they got into one and they realized they didn't really like it, they could change. But for boys, they had things like basketry, sign painting, bookbinding, printing, and girls could do things like sewing, cooking, embroidery. So all these programs were going on, and they actually all started at various different years. They didn't all start, okay, it's 1854, let's put all this out there. They just sort of, grew one after the other as he saw various needs. But by far, his most industrious endeavor was what was called free home placing out. Sometimes it was referred to as the placing out system. We now know it as the orphan trains, or the orphan train movement. It was not called orphan trains until the early 1960s. So this was a term that came about much later. It was free home placing out. This particular picture is also a very famous picture from the orphan train era. I think because there are so many children lined up against that train, that was very unusual. This is about 150 children on this particular train. Rarely happened. It was typically between 15 and 40 children would ride at any given time. So I think the fact that there were so many, it was like, oh, let's get a picture. So this is a picture that is very famous for this time period. The way the orphan trains worked, briefly, was notices would be sent to the various towns along the route where the train was going to be stopping, announcing what day and time the kids were going to be arriving, and if anyone was interested, they could come and see what was going on and perhaps take a child home. So when I was doing research for my books, I actually found the newspaper announcement announcing the train that my grandfather and his brother were on. So imagine you're sitting in Kansas in your farm and you open up your newspaper and you see a little advertisement and it says, "Homes for Orphan Children. A company of orphan children under the auspices of the Children's Aid Society of New York will arrive at Mankato on Friday, July 28th. These children are from orphanages, both boys and girls, 2 years old and up. They know nothing about street life." You think that's true? Of course not. "They are well-disciplined, well-dressed, intelligent children. Not a dummy among them. Parties can take them on trial. Adoption is not demanded. Applicants must be endorsed by a local committee. Those taking children must agree to send them to school the entire school year. Also send them to church and Sunday school, properly clothed and cared for, until they are boys 17 years old and girls 18. Distribution will take place Friday, July 28th at 10 a.m. at the Mankato Opera House. An address will be given by the agent. Come and see the children and hear the address." So you might say, well, we've got a lot of work to do on the farm and we don't have any children of our own. Maybe we'll go and check that out and see what's going on. Maybe we'll bring someone home. There was no pre-matching between families and children. So meanwhile, back at in New York City, at the orphanages, at the lodging houses, places like that, children were selected to ride the train. And actually, sometimes people would actually bring their child to the train or to the Children's Aid and say, "Can you please take my son on one of your trains out west? I can't take care of him. I think he'll have a better life there." So children came from all different places. Lots of them were not orphans. Many of them were half orphans, which means one parent was alive and one had died. But anyway, first they would select the children to ride. And like I said, they were riding about 30 to 40, in a group. So they would pick first whole orphans, children who had no parents alive. Then they would move on to half orphans. And if they had an address where they could find a living parent, they would try to reach them and let them know what they were going to be doing. In Oliver's case, because I've seen his orphanage records, his mother was alive, and it says on there that they attempted to reach Lizzie Nordmark, but she was not there, so the boys were sent west, and it gave the date. The children that were chosen were given a clean set of clothes, of course, a bath and a haircut, and if money allowed, there would be a little toy to take along on the train. A lot of times they tried to make sure the children had a Bible with them because it was a religious endeavor. Once they got on the train, they stayed on the train until they stopped at each of the towns along the way that had received the notices. And they would come off the train and they would line up on the stage of the local opera house. If there wasn't an opera house in town, they would use another public building. Even though it was a religious organization, they tried not to use churches because they didn't want to appear to favor one denomination over another. But if they had to, they would use a church. Sometimes it was just the platform at the train station. And once everybody was ready, then the local merchants and farmers would come in And they would walk up and down, and they would look over the children. And, you know, it's been referred to as similar to slavery, and I want to try to dispel that idea for you, because it wasn't like slavery at all. The children would literally do song and dance, recite poetry, try to be chosen, because what did they want? They wanted a family. They wanted a place to live. They wanted a home. And so they were trying to stand out. And yes, they would do things like go up and check muscles of boys to make sure they were strong, because yes, they were going to work. This was the middle of the 1800s, the early 1900s. Everybody worked. Everybody on a farm especially worked. A 3-year-old had a job on a farm. So it wasn't like, I'm going to take you off the train and my boys are going to watch you work, because that's not what was going on. Everybody worked. So yes, this program, the orphan trains, placing out as it was called, was meant to solve 2 problems. It was meant to solve the problem of so many homeless and destitute children in New York City, but it was also meant to solve the problem of a need for labor in the growing farm country. So it was the hope that the people would take the children, treat them as their own, and 2 problems would be solved. Interestingly, I'll just throw this in here because you're probably wondering, of the 250,000 children that's estimated that rode, 84% were positive placements. So it worked out pretty well. The plan for checking on the placements was that once every year, an agent from the territory, and the Children's Aid had agents throughout all their different territories, would go and check on each of the children to make sure everything was okay. If there was a problem, if a child wasn't working out well or was misbehaving and the family didn't want them any longer, then they would take the child and they would find him another home. In Oliver and Edward's case, they were placed together for a year, and when they got checked up on, the family decided that they were probably just a little too much work. They didn't have any children of their own, and they really didn't understand what little boys could get into, and they were just having fun. They didn't, you know, they weren't bad boys. But they took them, and they went on the orphan train a second time, and then they traveled a little further west in Kansas, where they were, second time they were separated. So once they went through the choosing process, if somebody was not chosen, they would get back on the train and they would go to the next town, and they would come off and they would do the same thing again with all the towns that had received notices. And if they got to the end of the line and there was a child left, what do you suppose would happen? Send him back. That would, in theory, that's what they would do. But they tried really hard not to let that happen because, of course, this child had just ridden from New York City. So what they typically would do would be to find somebody in the town who would be willing to keep the child for a short period of time until the agent in the territory could find a more permanent home. Maybe like the teacher in school or the doctor or somebody of prominence. So, no. Yes? How many times were they allowed to ride the train? Is that the question? They would ride the train as many times as they needed to find a home. Like I said, with Oliver and Edward, they rode twice. There are stories of other children who rode many more times than that. So my books were written based on 4 hours of audio recording that my father took of his father. And then he gave that tape to me for Christmas one year. And so when I listened to the tapes, I thought, wow, what's that all about? Let me find out more. And that's what got me interested in the orphan train movement. And what I want you to hear now is a little bit of that 4 hours recording. I promise it's nowhere near 4 hours. But you're going to be able to read along on the screen as well, because he's an older man when he's interviewed, and it is a little hard to understand some of his words. But this is what he thought, this is his impression of what happened to him to go through this process that I just outlined. Just wait.
Got put on the orphan trains at that point?
Yeah, I was in the orphanage for a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I took me, and then my brother and I got together. And we went to the orphanage. 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 And we went to and they took me in. And there must have been 25 or 30 kids that they took. And I remember there was a couple little babies, tiny babies. The matron was taking care of, but went with us. They took us and out and put us on a train. And
You had no idea where you were going.
no idea, but I enjoyed the trip, but looking at the scenery, going through the western state clear out to Kansas, took it about 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
And the eastern part of Kansas, the northeastern part, was in Nemaha County. And a little town there by the name of Burr, I can show it to you on the map, right in the northeastern part of Kansas. And in them days, they didn't have movies, they had opera houses. Most every good-sized town had an opera house and a stage, see? And it was all vaudeville in them days. And they took us and lined us up on the stage on chairs all along the stage, see? And people come out and they'd pick out what kid they wanted.
Farmers.
Huh?
The farmers?
Yeah. And I don't know, I guess they signed up for them. And so they didn't split us up that time. They let my brother go with me, and we went to a family where they spoke foreign language. They could speak English too.
So do you see where it says it was all vaudeville in them days? Does everybody know what vaudeville was? Okay, it was traveling entertainers that would go town to town. And that's part of the reason why a lot of the towns had the opera houses. And at the end it says they went to a family where they spoke a foreign language. They could speak English too. Well, in all those 4 hours of tape recording, he never said what language they spoke, and he didn't name them either. He didn't give us their last name. So when I was writing my first book, I had to name this family, and I wanted to be as authentic as I could. So I did research, and I found that Bern, Kansas, was settled by the Swiss and the Germans. And so I went to the internet, the trusty old internet, and I found a surname website of German surnames, and there were over 100 names. And I just sort of scrolled up and down, and I settled in on the name of Blauer, B-L-A-U-R. I just thought it sounded real German. Anyway, so I named them that, and I finished the book, and the book was published and out there. And then I got a packet of information from the Children's Aid Society, because back when I wrote my first book, which was 2004, the records of the orphan train riders through the Children's Aid Society existed, but they were in cardboard boxes in the building, in the basement of a building. So there was no cataloging, and things were hard to find, so it took a long time to get the information. If anyone's interested in finding a rider now, all of those records have been cataloged, and they're with the New York Historical Society in their library, so it's a lot easier to look up a rider and find information on them. But anyway, my packet of information came, and there was a lot of very interesting things in there, but the cover letter said, your grandfather, Oliver Nordmark, and his brother Edward traveled, and they had the date, from their orphanage, which was the Children's Village Orphanage in Dobbs Ferry, to Bern, Kansas, where they were placed with Mr. and Mrs. Henry Blauer. Wow is right. It wasn't that was like a wow moment. I said, and he had already passed away. So I'm like, wait a minute, how'd that happen? We'll never know, but that was my wow moment. Thank you very much. You can turn the slide. This is a picture of the Opera House in Bern, Kansas. It was called Turner Hall. That's the outside, so you can just imagine those little children going up those big steps. And then this is a picture of the stage. Now, those aren't orphan train riders. That's a band on the stage, but it's the only interior picture that exists. So do you remember I told you 2 people solved the problem of 30,000 homeless children on the streets of New York City? Reverend Brace was the first one. The second one I want to tell you briefly about is Sister Irene Fitzgibbon with the Sisters of Charity. Now, they were a religious order of nuns in New York City, and they, too, felt called by God to try to solve the problem, but they were mostly focused on the infanticide that was happening. Babies were being left on trash heaps, they were being left on church stairs, they were even finding bodies of babies in the river, just discarded because it was just such an impoverished time, and it was so many, people, they had no money to do anything other than get rid of the baby. So they were really concerned about that, and they started the New York Foundling Home. Anyone ever hear of that? It's also still in operation today and still helping children. Can turn the slide. They established the Foundling Home in October of 1869. They found a brownstone building. It needed some work. So they decided that they would do the work and open their doors January 1st of 1870. Well, that very first night, they had a baby left on the doorstep. So they decided they were open. And by the time January rolled around, when they thought they were going to open, they had 122 babies. So it was clearly a need, and they were solving it. What they would do is they placed a white cradle in the foyer of the Foundling Home, and they left the front door unlocked, and they got word on the street that any mother who had a baby, any time of the day or night, could bring it in and place it in the cradle, and just no questions asked, but please ring the bell on the way out so that we know there's a new baby in the house. And that actually worked very well. They moved the Foundling Home 3 times to larger spaces until they realized that they too needed another solution. And a lot of times babies were left in the cradle with no notes or anything, but oftentimes there were notes left, and so you can turn the slide. This is just an example. I'm going to read it for you because it's so far away, but this is a real note that was left with a baby in July of 1870, and it says, "To the sisters of the house, necessity compels me to part with my darling boy. I leave him hoping and trusting that you will take good care of him. God only knows the bitter anguish of my heart in parting with this little dear. Still, if it costs me my life, I am obliged to give him up. This is the last time I can speak of him as mine, and if in years to come I could hear that he had a home and kind friends, I could die in peace. On the other hand, if I should never hear, it would haunt the day of my death." And she left him. This is a book that was written by a friend of mine, Renee Wenninger. Her mother is an orphan train rider, and she's still alive. She's just turned 100. Renee's book, Extra Extra, has lots of letters in there that mothers left with their babies. Her mother traveled with, was placed out by the Foundling Home, so she's focused in on that aspect of the movement. You can turn it. So when it became too crowded and they needed another idea, they turned to the same idea as Reverend Brace as far as using trains, but their trains were called mercy trains, or sometimes they were referred to as baby trains, and they worked them differently. Because it was a Catholic organization, they wanted to make sure that the babies went to Catholic families. So instead of sending letters to newspapers where anybody could come and see what was going on, they actually sent notices to the parish priests and asked if they would find families within their congregations that would be willing to take a baby that was coming from New York City. So if I went to Mass on Sunday and I heard the priest announce this, I might say, "Well, gosh, husband, we have 3 boys. I'd like to have a little girl." So I could take a slip of paper and I could fill out exactly what I wanted. I could say, I would like a 2-year-old little girl with blonde curly hair, freckles, dimples, chubby cheeks, whatever. You could put whatever you wanted down. And then my request would go with everyone else's requests back to the Foundling Home, where the nuns would look through the babies that they had, and they would have upwards to 300 at any given time, and they would make a match or try to find a child that best fit the description that I was hoping to receive. Then they would do what's called tag the child, which a lot of people think means they just put a tag on them. But what it really meant was that they would sew or embroider my name and train station on the underside of the baby's dress. And even little boys wore dresses back then. And then I would get a notice in the mail that told me what day and time to go to the train station with my notice in hand, and it would be matched up with the baby's dress, and that's how I would get the baby that was chosen for me. Because the people who are doing the choosing and the matching are the nuns back in the Foundling home. They're not riding the trains. So the matrons that are going on the train have to know what baby to give to what family. Go back, please. Interestingly, a lot of the children who traveled on the baby trains through the sisters were actually adopted by the people who took them in, where a lot of the children who traveled on the orphan trains through the Children's Aid Society were not actually adopted by the people who took them. Oliver and Edward were never adopted by anyone. They went to different homes along the way, and no one ever adopted them. Why do you suppose that might be? They're older. The children on the orphan trains through the Children's Aid are older. They already know a whole nother life. They already know another place. Incidentally, the children who rode the trains through the Children's Aid, they were told not to talk about it. Don't talk about where you came from. Don't talk about New York City. If you remember your parents, don't talk about them because you're going to a new place. It might as well have been the moon. It was so far away. And you're going to want to try to fit in your new family, in your new school, your new church. And if you're always talking about New York City and everything that happened there, it's going to be harder for you to do. So mostly they didn't talk about it. And that's pretty much how it happened that we didn't know about it for so long. But a lot of the babies were adopted because, number one, they're babies. They don't remember anything. And after I sent off my request for a blonde-haired 2-year-old little girl, what do you suppose I was doing? That baby's not showing up for another 1 or 2 months. Right, I'm getting ready. So I'm getting ready. I'm having my husband build a cradle. I'm probably knitting booties. I'm sewing clothes, knitting blankets. I'm probably going to church on Sunday and bragging about the 2-year-old little blonde girl that's coming. And lo and behold, when she shows up and she looks just like what I asked for, I've already made her a part of my family. And I know that someone's coming in a year's time to check up. So it's going to be a situation I'm probably going to want to make more permanent than somebody who actually just went into an opera house. And, you know, maybe we went in thinking I could use help in the house. Maybe there weren't any girls there that were suitable. So maybe we brought a boy home to help with the hawks. You know, so it wasn't all planned out the other way. So because this was more matched ahead of time, I think is why a lot of the children were actually adopted. This is a group of babies all ready to ride the baby train. And they have their dollies in hand, and you see my little blonde, curly-haired one in the middle. She looks a little forlorn. I don't know. Any questions at this point about how these two programs work, the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Home? I answered every question. Oh, boy. Yes? Right, he's asking how was it funded? There were agents to be paid for it, there was train rides, there was clothing, there was food, right. Typically the train was donated by the railroad and it would be one car. It would be the least appealing car. It might be a box car, but it was usually donated. The agents were paid and of course clothing was purchased. Everything was funded, and this is hard to believe, but it is the truth, through donations. When we look at the minutes of the meetings of the Children's Aid Society, and they're all online, but I've seen hand copies as well, you can see where they're heavily focused on fundraising and reaching out to people of means. A lot of famous people, all the Roosevelts were friends of Reverend Brace's, and they donated tons of money. And they got their wealthy friends to donate money, because remember, they've seen the pictures now. They see how people are living. They see the crime that's happening. They see nothing but all these children growing up in this kind of a situation, and it's only going to get worse. So they're opening their wallets, and they're literally continuously being solicited for money to help. So it was all funded through donations. Thank you. Good question. It looks like there's only 2 little boys there. You'd be surprised how many of those are boys. Yeah, they all wore dresses. It made for easier diapering at the time if everybody just had a dress on. And there are boys there. Probably more girls than boys, but there are in the front row especially, I can see 4 boys right in a row. She's not believing me. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did like bad things happen to these companies like during World War I when people were
I'm sorry, start the beginning of the question again.
Did bad things in terms of money happen to these organizations because of World War I and people were focusing on money?
Okay, he's wondering if more people turn their donations toward war efforts as opposed to the orphan train movement. I don't have an exact answer for that, but I do know that the funding continued. The orphan train movement peaked in 1875. In that year, 4,026 children were transported out of New York City. And then it slowly came down like this on the other end until 1929, when the last train traveled to Texas with 4 children on board. So the funding continued throughout, and I don't know an exact answer as far as what percentage went toward war versus this kind of a charitable donation, but certainly, it continued to be funded. Anyone else? Yes.
As I've been looking at the photographs, I haven't seen too many children of color. Was there a deliberate decision to marginalize children of color, or was there a
Yes.
more practical reason?
Yes, it was a very practical reason. They needed to find a home, and there weren't a lot of African American families in the West to take the children. So, when we look at the numbers, we see 1 year 3 African American children went that month, and this month 1 went. So there's like a spattering of children. But one thing that did happen was the children that came into the New York Foundling home who were African American, they were transported to, I'm trying to remember the name of the organization, but it was another organization of nuns. Providence was Oblates of something of Providence, I forget the whole title. But they were a group of African American nuns who took in only African American children. So a lot of children that came into these organizations that way were then transferred to Baltimore. I'm trying to remember their name. Oblates something Providence. Something like that. We'll have to look that up. Yes. Yes. You're a brilliant young man, but no. Everybody thinks that the orphan train movement ended because it ended in 1929, and that's when the stock market crashed in October, right? And so they think, oh, it must have been that. Nobody wanted to give any more money toward the effort. But the truth of the matter is, when we look at the minutes of the meetings, 7 or 8 years prior to that, we see them talking about winding the effort down and bringing it to an end. And the reasons for that were many, but one of them was that a lot of the receiving states started to put up their hands and say, you know what, we have enough of your New York City orphans, thank you very much. They actually started to enact laws that forbid the transport of children without their parents across state lines. So if you need to get to Kansas and you can't go through Iowa or Indiana or Illinois, how are you going to do that? We're not going to jump over. So that became a problem, if you couldn't transport. And also, new programs were coming under development to help children where they were at, to keep them closer to their birth families. And the whole concept of childhood was changing. What we should expect for our children was starting to change. So all those things together, and then of course the stock market crash, wrapped it up. But the last train ran in May of 1929 to Texas. Yes.
Were there any specific groups or political parties or anything that were involved with trying to bring this to an end?
Were any political groups trying to bring it to an end? Not that I'm aware of. Why? What are you going to follow up with? Oh, no, I'm not aware of any connection to that. I do know that Reverend Brace was an abolitionist, and he refused to send, during the Civil War, he refused to send any children south, black or white. He was just, we're staying up here. You know, we're not going. Okay, so now, what's your name, sir? Tom has sent me off for more research. Because we have to know if the Klan was involved at all. I don't know. I've never heard that. I've never heard that. I do know what I recently found out, and I found this interesting, is from the 1920s on, and remember this lasted another 9 years, there were pretty much just 5 states that were receiving children at that time. Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Delaware. Now, how does Delaware fit into that group? Well, it turns out a superintendent from the Children's Aid Society lived in Delaware, and he was bringing them down. Come down to Delaware. So, but those were, as it was winding down, those were the 5 states that were still receiving. My grandfather was a writer. Did he say whether he had a good life? He had a lot to say. He had a lot to say. He did not like the first family that he was placed with. You'll read about that in Fly, Little Bird Fly, and exactly what kind of people they were and the things that they did to and for the boys. And the second family that he went with, he was fine with them. It wasn't, you know, oh, we love you so much, you're our son, we're so glad you're here, but it was a good placement. You know, he wasn't abused, he went to school, he went to work, you know, he did the typical things that that this program hoped a typical child would experience. So that was his take on it. His brother, on the other hand, when they were separated, his brother went to a different farmer, and he was abused. So he was abused to the point where he was shipped back east. So the problem was that, you know, the plan was that every year an agent from the territory would check up on the children who had been placed. And the problem is that this was such a popular program, and it was so well received, and it grew so quickly that they lost track of all the children. They couldn't actually check up on every child. Another system that they had in place was that every child twice a year was supposed to write back either to Reverend Brace or to their agent. I actually have letters that were in the file of Oliver writing to Reverend Brace and telling him what kind of crops they were bringing in, what he was doing at school, you know, just what's your life like kind of thing. And then also the families that took a child once a year were required to write to either the agent or Brace, depending on if there was an agent, you know, that they could write to. And so these were 3 ways that they had for checking up. It was a different time. You know, we couldn't just hop on the internet and check. We couldn't, even to write a letter took longer. So they did the best that they could. It's estimated that 84% of the placements were positive. So for what they had to work with, we feel like that's a really good turnout. That's 110,000 of the 250,000 kids who wrote had a positive placement. And you can argue, what does positive mean? You know, it means you weren't abused. You didn't have to sleep in the barn. You know, you were taken in and you were cared for. Okay, we can turn. After Oliver... Oh, she went too far. Okay. This is a picture of the Orphan Train Museum in Concordia, Kansas. This was opened in 2007. It's an actual train depot from the period that was brought to the site and renovated. In the men's waiting room you'll learn all about the Children's Aid Society and Reverend Brace and his work. And in the ladies' waiting room, you'll learn all about the New York Foundling Home. And then on the floor of both rooms, they have traveling exhibits. They actually have an exhibit of Oliver and Edward where you can hear more of the audio recordings and see more of the documentation from their life at that time. But they move in and out of the museum so that you see different things, because I'm sure we'll all be there at least 5 or 6 times in our lives. Right? Turn. They also have a research center there. So if you were interested in researching a writer, you could contact them, and they do research right there, as well as the New York Historical Society. So what I was going to tell you is my second book, Beyond the Orphan Train, The Boys Are Separated. And Oliver, they were told that they would see each other 4 times a year. But 7 years have gone by, and Oliver hasn't seen his brother, and he's getting a bit anxious. And no one's telling him, no one's answering his questions. Where's my brother? What happened to him? Why aren't I seeing him? So when he goes into town for 4th of July fireworks, he decides, you know what? That train came in. He looked at it and said, when that train leaves, I'm leaving with it. So he hid down in the grass. Back in the day, you know, you had your railroad track, and your town was on one side, and the other side had nothing but grass or whatnot. And so he hid down in the grass over here, and when the train started to take off, he jumped up and he started chasing the train and grabbed onto the side and held on for 200 miles to Goodland, Kansas, which is almost to the Colorado line, where he got off and he got in with what he called a group of hoboes. And they were going to work for a rancher. They were holding out for $4.25 a day, $4.25 a day. But he was hungry, and he agreed to go for $4. So he went with a rancher named McCall for $4 a day and board. And he wanted him to help build a sod house. Anybody ever see a sod house in person? There's still some sod houses in America that you can see. There's a state park in Kansas called Prairie Dog State Park, and you can actually look into a sod house there. They actually even made them 2-story, if you can believe that. But it's a house made of dirt. It's made out of the earth. Even the roof is made out of the earth. The walls are about 2 feet thick. When it rains, the roof, of course, gets wet. It's dirt, so it starts dripping down. Sound like fun? She's looking at me like, oh, really? So anyway, a little bit more to listen to from the tape recording is Oliver telling you what it was like to live inside the sod house. Don't turn that yet.
I was living in the sod house in a double bed with this young boy, wasn't he? And at nighttime, you had to take your shoes and tie them together and hang them up on the bedpost.
Oh.
The rats would chew them all to pieces.
Oh, dear.
And they get up on the bed, rats would.
Oh,
You move over, then they jump off. So, and in the nighttime, when you move over good, they'd scare them. My God, it sounded like a herd of cattle running into their holes.
How could you stand it?
There's so many rats. You know, them rats could dig into the walls.
Yeah.
And
They ever bite you?
Huh?
Did one ever bite you?
Yeah. Nibble on your toes, you know.
Oh.
But when you move, then they jump off. Oh, there was a terrible
That's
mess of rats
terrible.
around. Because they had so much grain to eat.
Yeah.
See?
Was he married, this guy?
Huh?
The guy, was he married? The man you built the house for?
Oh, yeah.
So him and his wife lived there?
Yeah.
And you
But
lived
she
with
didn't
him?
live there until we got the house built.
Yeah. Right.
We built I think it was a 2-room house in a petition in the center of it. That was a sod too. And it's a nice big kitchen.
How'd you cook?
Huh?
How did you cook in there?
Look, well, they had kerosene. And they also had, that was their standby, kerosene, but they had stoves, and they buried corn cobs
Mm-hmm.
and cow chips. You ever hear that?
Yep, buffalo chips.
Cow chips.
Yeah.
We take a wagon, go out on the prairies where the cattle were, you know. We pick up these cow chips, they're like a big pancake,
Yeah.
burnt dry, you know, from the sun.
Cow
We
manure.
pick them up, and they got a whole big wagon load for them. Then take them and we store them in a dry place so they wouldn't get wet. And then they burnt like the dickens.
Okay, we're coming into winter. You got your cow chips ready? So in 2010, I was in Kansas on a book tour, And I was talking in an auditorium, it was a school auditorium, so it might have been 500 people there. And at the end, this man came, literally, like pushing people away to get up to me. And he says, I just wanted you to know that we live in Salina, the town over, and we still heat with cow chips. I know, I was the same way, like, oh. And he swore they didn't smell. They didn't smell. So apparently they're a good source of heat. I don't know. Okay. So this is Oliver's children. My father, Benny, is the little boy in the end with the black shirt. He's the one that was interviewing him on the tapes. These are his siblings during the Great Depression. This is a period of time. This picture was taken when they were in Children's Aid Society foster home. So there were clothing. That was something that you got, new clothes if you went with another family. He's the only one alive at this point. He'll be 87 in February, but they all did live pretty long lives. Now, interestingly, you might wonder with the orphan train movement, what were the outcomes? What did people become? Were they all farmers? What happened? Well, it ran the gamut. We had, farmers and homemakers and school teachers and statesmen, but we have a couple of famous people, too, I want to tell you about. John Green Brady rode an orphan train, and he became the governor of the Alaskan Territory. He actually has a great-grandson who, the last I was in touch with him, he was a teacher at the Sanford School here in Delaware. So that was a local connection. Andrew Burke rode an orphan train. He became the governor of North Dakota. Amazingly, I find this pretty amazing, both these boys rode the same train, and they got off in Indiana. And when they got off, the local judge in town went up to the people in charge and said, I want you to give me the orneriest, most hard-headed boy you got on that train because I'm going to show you that I can make something out of him. And he got Andrew Burke. I guess he knew how to make something out of a boy, didn't he? Can turn the slide. We also claim Billy the Kid. So it really did run the gamut. And like I said, Oliver, my grandfather, he took what he learned from the orphan train movement, a few lessons. No one's looking out for you except for you. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And finally, your life is your own, and you can do with it what you want. And when bad things happen in your life, you can decide to fall down and never get back up, or you can decide to turn your life around and do something with it. His brother Edward rode the same orphan train, was in the same family the first time, and he had a very unfortunate experience. Edward didn't fare so well. He spent a lot of his time in prison. He just never really bounced back from any of that. And his brother, a lot of times Oliver would say, I don't understand. I don't understand why he does what he does. If I was hungry plenty of times, he said. I'd go to a restaurant, go to the back of the door and say, can I have a piece of bread? Or a job. Do you have a job I could have? He didn't understand that somebody could actually commit crime against another human being. So a lot is what you make of your own life. And like I said, 84% of the placements were deemed positive. And so when we look at the history of the orphan train movement, 75 years, it really was the beginning of foster care in America. If you're any of you studying to be social workers, you'll learn all about the orphan train movement, I'm sure. You might already know about it. Because it's recognized as the beginning of foster care in America. And these are my books. They are available if you're interested. I have a website, orphantrainbook.com, and I'll stay as long as you have questions. And I thank you very much for having me. Are there any other questions?
We have some time for questions. I would just ask if you raise your hand to wait until a microphone comes to you for the people who are on the live stream.
If you can hear me, I'll speak loud enough. What did Oliver do with his life? How did that go? Move on.
Oliver married. He was 18. His wife was 15. He met her on a train. And he had 6 children. Unfortunately, at the start of the Great Depression, it was 1930, his wife begged him to be able to take a job at the local coffee shop in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. They lived in Stroudsburg. It was called the Indian Queen. And he was out of work. He was a silk weaver at the time, but they were on strike trying to get better labor conditions. And he finally said, okay, you can go for that job. And she got the job. It was a Memorial Day weekend. It was her second day on the job, and she was killed. So he had to raise his children during the Great Depression by himself. He had no idea how to do that. If you read the first two books, you'll realize he didn't really have a good parent figure to know what to do. But what he did know was that he wanted to make sure his boys, especially had 4 boys, had the childhood that he knew he didn't get. So it was fun. My father will tell you it was fun growing up with his dad because he was always looking for another adventure for his kids, and he would join right in there with them. He had no money, but he made sure they got to see the World's Fair, 1936, I think it was, 37. He got in an old jalopy and made a wagon out of the back and drove them up there. He had no money to get in, but some of the exhibits were free, so they got to see some of the things that were there. He had many trades. He was a silk weaver. He was glass worker. He was a welder by trade. He worked on the reconstruction of Pearl Harbor. He was very adventurous. He traveled in an RV all over our country, down through Central America. In the 1980s, when we said, "Granddad, you better not do that. They're fighting down there." "Oh, don't worry. Everybody likes me." Off he went, and he made it back. He traveled to Ireland to kiss the Blarney Stone. He learned to scuba dive when he was retired. In his 60s, he learned how to fly an airplane, and he bought one. My father wouldn't let us go up with him. He was a smart man. So he had a very full life. He died when he was 95 in 1994. He probably would have lived longer, but he was riding his bicycle, and his hearing wasn't that great, and he turned into traffic and got hit by a small truck. So he didn't die right away. He said, "I'm fine." Went home and started to have some mini strokes, so then he went into nursing care. So, but he had a very full life. He made something out of it. Yeah. Oliver died when he was 50, or not Oliver, Edward died when he was 58, his brother, and they're buried side by side in East Stroudsburg, along with Estella, his wife. Oh yeah, they got back together. Edward actually died in Oliver's house. The prison let him out because he was dying and they didn't want to pay for the burial. So they let him out and he went to Oliver's house and died there. So I guess that's what they did back then. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you coming out, and I hope you learned something. Please share.
Thank you so much, Donna.